Well, I wasn't able to complete late night fare, so I'll have to take up somewhat before I was cut off and complete it. So this will be part 2. Let's see. Okay, so he's been invited by Tommy Sands, who has a late night talk show, to appear on his show as a guest. Okay, I'll start here. In the field of technological innovation, Wilson enjoyed a modest success. Along with the substantial uptick of income, talk show hosts had begun to invite him onto their programs. With the new holograph technology, interactive talk shows had become standard fare. As long as people had holographic cameras in their living rooms, they could be seen on a national talk show in a brief dialogue with the celebrity host or one of the evening's guests. This illusion of being able to hobnob with actors and politicians and writers and scientists and corporate CEOs, of course, soon became all the rage. As long as they chose you from the tens of thousands of phone-in calls, you would gain national exposure, however brief. As a matter of fact, Wilson was recently invited to appear on Tommy Sands' late night show. This would be Wilson's first strictly non-technical forum, and he was a bit nervous. In only 4 more days, he would have to appear in front of a live audience. Of course, there would be a script. Those people leave nothing to chance. Wilson himself watched very little television, and at first had no idea who this Sands fellow even was. After watching the late night show with Tommy Sands, Wilson got a sense of the man, a satiric-minded comedian who wanted to leave you with the impression that he was better informed than most when it came to cutting-edge technology. Those few 4 days drove Wilson into a fit of continual nervous tension. Even in his own home, sometimes his eyes would dart about at the slightest noise from outdoors. He grew more apprehensive each day as this special night approached. The evening arrived, and he felt very much himself as he put on a fresh shirt and knotted his necktie. He felt up to par, as his father might have said, a man who played golf to be sociable. The television studio would send a special hover shuttle to pick him up. Wilson left his large landscaped home and walked to the street and up to the limousine. A door slid open, and as he moved to get inside this posh conveyance, he saw that he was not to be the only passenger. Already seated on a firm leather-covered cushion was a blonde woman in a black evening dress. Thank God he was wearing a suit, otherwise he would have looked like a bumpkin in boots or sneakers. "Hello," Wilson greeted her while getting seated, never once taking his eyes from her startling, beautiful face. Breathtaking beauty, Wilson was thinking, and said, "I'm delighted to meet you, whoever you are." "My name's Willow McSimmons, Mr. Wilson. I'm your guide for the evening. You can think of me that way if you like. We know this is all entirely new for you, and the sense of social experience, if I may be so bold. And first of all, we're not very formal, although sometimes we use the word doctor, but only for MDs. You only have to look at this whole business from Tommy's perspective, which is the show business angle. Out in front of the audience, everyone's on equal footing, as though everyone sees each other all the time, which is obviously impossible. No one ever says a bad word about anyone, but we do laugh at people. Now, you've gone through the script we've sent you, right? So you know that Tommy is going to crack a few jokes at your expense, but As you saw, our writers won't let Tommy get away with it completely because they've given you some good comebacks. So, David, do you think you're ready? Barring a collision prior to reaching the studio, I expect I'll do well enough, Wilson replied. Almost 3 hours later, Wilson sat alone in the studio's green room and watched the large wall-mounted monitoring screen as Tommy's nightly show proceeded to its conclusion. The three other guests were already out on stage with Tommy, who seemed to be winding up his interview with the third guest. Wilson had seen Willow drop in just for a moment before she had led each of the other guests to the stage. At any moment she'd be back for him. Almost as he thought of this, Willow came into the green room. "You'll be up in a moment, David. We don't want to keep the audience waiting." He followed her down a hallway through one of the backstage doors. As soon as they were inside, he could hear Tommy telling his audience about his next guest. Wilson felt a swooping sense of vertigo as he heard Willow whisper into his ear, "When Tommy asks the audience to welcome you with their applause, that's your cue, my friend. Just walk on out there and greet Tommy. We'll talk later." With that, she disappeared. A moment later, Wilson heard his cue, and he stepped beyond the curtain into the glaring lights of the television stage set where Tommy performed his nightly sessions of wit and satire. He stepped up to the wide, curving desk behind which Tommy was now standing, crossed in front of it, up toward the vacant seat next to the desk. The three other guests, 2 men and a woman, 2 actors and a singer, glanced at him as he approached, all of them wearing benign smiles as he shook hands with each of them. After a vigorous, quick handshake with Tommy, Wilson sat down and Tommy made some ad-lib remark about the handshake, which drew laughter from the audience. "So, as I explained to everyone, for your intro, David, you are basically the inventor of a device that has completely transformed holographic images," Tommy said. Then, glancing out toward the audience, he continued, "As everyone knows, up until David's invention, these images were always semi-transparent, some would say ghostly, but now they are opaque and entirely eerily convincing." "That's right," Wilson said. "Now a man won't be able to tell the difference between his wife and a holographic image of his wife. And she can broadcast that image to anyone with one of those receiving devices you design." "Yes, that's right. Oh, this just might lead to some very unexpected encounters. Huh. What do you folks in the audience think?" After the audience subsided from a sound of raucous laughter, he said, "In fact, just to underscore what I'm talking about, we're going to show the studio audience how this can all work out in weird and interesting ways." What the hell was Tommy doing, Wilson thought. This wasn't part of the script. The audience was taken by surprise when Willow suddenly appeared on Wilson's lap with her arms around his neck. Instead of her evening dress, however, she was wearing sheer scarlet lingerie. Laughter from the audience roared in his ears, and for just a moment he thought he caught a trace of the perfume which his guide had worn that evening. All right. Next story is titled "The Abduction." The abduction. All right. So, such a slow arousal into consciousness, he thought, and began to lift his head. He was on a sandy beach. He was on a sandy beach, and with this realization, he scrambled to his feet because he knew, deep down, he knew that he didn't belong there. The impression of the idea was almost enough for him to grab onto it and let it carry him like a horse carries its rider. But then he dropped back to the surface of the beach over which he had been floating for a moment. "You have to follow me," the voice said. Yet he heard this utterance only as a faint whisper, emptied of emotion. Then he opened his eyes and he saw them, rows of them which rose like steeply rising rings of seats in an old-fashioned lecture hall, particularly a medical lecture hall. They composed a wide arc, perhaps 50 of them, a different species of man. They were a composite of ape and lizard. Their skins glistened in faint spectrums like oil on water. He could see that each of them were individuals as well as members of a select group. How could they not be? "Why have you done this to me?" he asked, both outraged and terrified. "Why have you brought me here into this arena?" he said shakily, barely able to control his trembling. "What if we were to say you brought yourself here? What would you say in reply to that?" "That still doesn't explain how you transported me here to the shore of a tropical island." "You're right," one of them said a moment later. "We don't propose to share our knowledge and experience with you." "No, of course not. The one thing I can be sure of, you gentlemen didn't come here to meddle in our day-to-day business like frustrated and curious scientists." "No, don't bother to anticipate any of that," the same one said. "We have an assortment of objectives, although none of these include studying your very cultures and ways of life. That sort of thing requires far too much time." "A few of us are scientists," another said. "A lot of us are lawyers and engineers. We even have a construction foreman among our ranks, along with a group of skilled laborers who can work on building habitat structures under zero-G conditions if necessary." The young man heaved a deep sigh as he stood before this seated crowd who all looked down at an angle to see him. He turned his head slowly from side to side to look at all of them. But at the present moment, by all rights, he should be trembling, yet his terror had already abated. They must have drugged me, he thought. At least, at the moment, they do not appear to do him any imminent harm. A third one spoke. "You seem resigned to this situation. So far, you have not shown the least defiance or resistance." "I don't expect that would do me any good. You can put a stop to anything I say quick enough. What good would it do me?" "We want to ask you some questions," the first one said. He had the greatest number of lines etched into his forehead. "For starters, what do we call you?" "My name's Porter, Doug Porter." "Then we will call you Porter, or do you prefer Mr. Porter?" "Call me Porter, for hell's sake." "Porter it is, Porter. Now then, we have a lot of ground to cover, so we'll get right to it. What we first want to know is, are you humans all alike, or are you dissimilar, perhaps even unique?" Porter looked at his hands. "On the tips of my fingers and thumbs are intricate patterns in the surface of the skin. None of these patterns are ever exactly the same for any two people, except in the case of identical twins." "How fascinating. Then you're all different," one of them said. Only to an extent. We live in groups. We conduct war in groups, most of us anyway." "Do you live in a group, Porter?" No, I live alone. Do you prefer to do so? Yes. Some of them sitting side by side would confer with one another, leaning into each other a bit and speaking in their language. Apart from their skin and lack of hair, their bone structure was similar to that of a human. Another one asked, why do you humans conduct war on such a regular basis? I don't know, said Porter. Humans have a primitive nature. We all have a tendency to fear the unknown. Large numbers of people from foreign countries make us particularly nervous. You have an extraordinary number of groups on your planet, the first one said. Yes, very many. A single province in China has over 50 ethnic groups, each with their own hill language. There are hundreds of Indian tribes in the United States, each with their own language. The entire planet is inhabited, another asked. The Antarctic is cold and desolate year-round. No one lives there except a few dozen research scientists and their support crew. So why all the warfare, Porter? I don't know. We're still afraid of each other, unlike you lot, I'd wager. What makes you think that we have solved the problem of war? Haven't you? Yes, we have. How long did it take? Not quite 300,000 years. So what are you people on? An excursion? Porter asked. Yes, we've been exploring the galaxy for a few hundred years now. We've compiled quite an itinerary. We leapfrog from one solar system to the next with a planet in the inhabitable zone. How did you learn English so well? Porter asked. Your television broadcasts, said the first one. Before any of us can go on one of these excursions, we must study at least 3 languages from each planet around which we intend to establish a stationary orbit. Otherwise, we would not be able to appreciate what you and others like you tell us. Oh, what you're telling me is amazing, said Porter. And yet I'm compelled to believe you that that is inescapable. We are pleased thus far. I think you gentlemen will agree. Hear, hear, they all said. Porter slowly turned left to right, his hands held outward. He was representing the planet. He made several short bows to all of them. And then he felt himself topple, his legs going out from under him, and he felt the force of his head striking the floor, composed of an extremely hard synthetic fiber. He woke late the next morning, convinced that something extraordinary had happened to him, that he had just had a nice long chat with a bunch of aliens in a 19th century lecture hall for surgery and medicine. He had seen how their skin reflected light. Around any portion of their exposed skin there was a visible aura. Porter had looked at their faces, amazed by this seeming transformation into creatures who looked so much different from us. But they had asked him dozens upon dozens of questions. You'd think they'd never quit asking things. And then they finally let you go, and you drifted back to sleep and quite soon forgot all about it. A few nights later, the same thing happened again. He fell asleep and then dreamed of waking up on the beach, only to once again be whisked away to a 19th century medical lecture hall and once again be quizzed for any tourist tips he could give them, the aliens. So now Doug was finally convinced these dreams, which were becoming more and more distinct in his memory, had actually occurred.